once upon a time, in an era called the 1970s, in a place called Fort Wayne, Indiana, there lived a little boy named me, who, when he reached the age where he could satisfactorily hold a pencil in his left hand and write his name somewhat legibly and spell it correctly most of the time, was determined to be ready for further schooling. That was the custom in that time and place. So my parents were dissatisfied with the educational options that existed for me at that time in Fort Wayne, which basically meant public schools or Catholic schools. They felt the former were insufficiently rigorous and likely to encourage conformity at the expense of creativity. They felt the latter were overly doctrinal and likely to involve angry nuns smacking me with a ruler. Now, I doubt that that is still a thing in Catholic schools, but back in my parents' day, it was definitely a thing, angry nuns with rulers, and they have no overfond memories of that practice. So what my parents did is they got together with some other parents who shared similar concerns, and they decided to start a school of their own. It would be modeled after what at that time was called a free school, which was a place where children would be free to be themselves, express their creativity, learn at their own pace, and just generally color outside the lines, while still upholding very high standards of learning and intellectual engagement. And it was designed to be not just educationally progressive, but also radically socially progressive. A social justice curriculum was built into the heart of the school. There were about 40 kids. At the time, I had 3 teachers who were feminists and peaceniks and socialists and religious freethinkers, and just very much of their time. So while I was filling out like endless ditto sheets of phonics and multiplication tables, I was also learning about racism and sexism and no nukes and nonviolence and ecology and the Vietnam War and food co-ops and on and on. Also, there was a lot of macrame for some reason. So one of the things I remember very much about that school is that democracy was central to how it operated. At the start of the year, all of us kids got together. Usually there was an acoustic guitar involved, and we would write the rules for the year that we wanted to obey. Very similar to the way our youth here at UUI will create a covenant for themselves for a particular project or for the school year or for a con or for whatever they're going to do. And then aside from our set of rules, our covenant that we had, twice a week there were these afternoon meetings where you get together as a group. And at the meetings, the kids would bring up disagreements and grievances and problems. And that was where you would discuss them and you would work out solutions. Now that's how you would resolve a critical problem like the bigger kids are hogging the dodgeball court, right? You would get together in a meeting and work it out. And the only punishment the school had for misbehaving children was the dreaded sentence, "You lose your voice." And if a teacher told you that you lose your voice, it meant that you could not speak in the next meeting. You just had to sit there and watch democracy happen without your participation as a silent witness. And if you happen to have a stake in the issue, you could not advocate for your side. You could not defend yourself against the worst of calumnies and slander. You could not correct the historical record. You could not vote on solutions. So this was a very bad position to be in. Will the next craft project be spin art or macrame? It is out of your hands. You've lost your voice. So this year, we've been talking about our 7 principles of Unitarian Universalism, devoting a month to each principle. And so far we've looked at the first 4, the inherent worth and dignity of each person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, and a free and responsible search for truth in meaning. So in February, we're going to be looking at our 5th principle, which is, we affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of democratic processes within our congregations and in society at large. So the 5th principle is, on its surface anyway, I've always thought a little bit of an odd duck. Certainly the first part, respect for the right of conscience, is right in line with the principles that precede it, and it is part and parcel of our historical insistence of the freedom of the individual to pursue their own truth and abide by their own moral sense. In Reverend A. Powell Davies' framing, we respect the right of the individual to be a nonconformist, to be the captain of their own soul. We respect the right of conscience. But the second part of the principle is a little bit odd to have a political decision mechanism, democracy, upheld as a religious value by a religious organization. And in fact, when the two groups that became Unitarian Universalism existed prior to that, the American Unitarian Association had no mention of democracy in its charter. The Universalist Church of America had no mention of democracy in its charter, but when they came together in 1961 and formed the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UUA, the bylaws explicitly affirmed the use of the democratic method in human relationships. So that was somehow distilled out of each party's understanding of what was important to their religion. And that emphasis was later incorporated into our 7 principles. This information, by the way, comes from an essay by Earl Holt in a book called Principles and Purposes. Now, Holt points out that both Unitarianism and Universalism came of age during the era of the American Revolution, when democracy was part of a philosophic revolution, the Enlightenment, which affirmed the power and the worth of the individual in a revolutionary way, putting the individual above the demands of the community or the state or the church in a way that had never happened before. Democracy, says Holt, is more than just a mechanism of government. It's an expression of faith in the power of human beings to shape their own lives. A faith that is most explicit in the ideals of our religious tradition. And in this context, of course, we're shaping our lives in community with others. Right? If there's just only one person, there's no need for democracy. We have a magic 8-ball that will suffice for most of our decision-making. Right? Should I have another piece of pie? It is decidedly so. But when we're talking about collective action, then we need a decision-making process, and democracy in our religious tradition is conceived to be the way that provides the most protection for individual dignity, for autonomy, and for freedom of conscience by giving everyone an equal say in the outcome. And the way we frame that concept for our youth is we say the 5th principle means that everyone has a voice. Everyone has a voice. Now, this ideal, of course, is not understood as something that is just good for our congregations or just good for us Unitarian Universalists. It's a universal principle. It's understood by us as a general foundation for human freedom and human flourishing. We want to have a say in the communities we are a part of. We want to be active participants in shaping our common destiny. And we want that for our neighbors as well. And indeed, for much of our history, especially as a social justice-seeking people, which we have always been, our understanding of our religious mission has included work to expand the boundaries of democracy in America, beginning with the long struggle against slavery, which culminated in the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing freed slaves the right to vote, a right, of course, that was most cruelly taken away, followed by the work of Unitarian and Universalist women like Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, fighting for women's suffrage in the 19th century, culminating in the right to vote in the 20th century for women. And then, of course, UUs were intimately involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s to finally help secure equal voting rights for African Americans with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we were intimately involved in all of that, and it's always been our understanding that part of our religious mission is to spread democracy, to give other people a say in their destiny and a voice to be heard. Today, the specter of mass disenfranchisement comes in a different form. It comes in the form of mass incarceration. And UUs are beginning to wake up to that struggle as well. For more information on that, I refer you to Michelle Alexander's The Book, The New Jim Crow, which was the UUA recommended read for 2013. We talked about that last August here at UUI. I think that sermon is available online. But of course, just giving everyone a voice is not in and of itself enough, because democracy is no guarantee of freedom and justice in and of itself. Sometimes some voices are louder than others to begin with, through wealth or influence or position or what have you, and democracy becomes corrupted. Sometimes the voices of the majority overwhelm and drown out the voices of the minority or the individual, and democracy becomes the tyranny of the majority. We could almost say, paraphrasing a famous quote, that democracy is actually the worst system for protecting minorities, except for all of the other systems. Because after all, perhaps the most famous democratic vote in history was the one that condemned Socrates to drink the hemlock. So in our fifth principle, as with our other principles, we can find a certain tension. You have the right of conscience, and you have the right to have a voice, and you have a process of majority rule that can sometimes at least trample consciences and stifle voices. So how do you deal with that tension? And there are different approaches. In UU churches, we tend to use a standard majority rule democratic process, and our care and protection for the individual is supposed to be found in our principles itself. That's why we interpose democracy with right of conscience. They're supposed to be intimately tied together in our understanding of how this works. And the other principles in the seven are supposed to keep in mind all the time justice, equity, and compassion, the free search for truth and meaning, the encouragement to spiritual growth. And we also rely on our larger covenant for why we're all here, and then maybe behavioral covenants that we might have that spell out in more detail how we expect to treat one another in our conversations and our decision-making. But the challenge with any kind of majority vote system is always dealing with decisions that create winners and losers and the impact on the community when it happens. And every community that has that kind of process struggles with that outcome, and we have struggled with it before and no doubt will again. It's part of the process. In Quaker churches, and in some social justice movements like Occupy Wall Street, they have a different idea of the majority rule democratic vote. They enhance that with the idea of consensus or consensus building, which is kind of like democracy on steroids. It's vote, but it requires unanimous vote or a nearly unanimous vote before anything can be enacted. And so consensus building processes involve rounds and rounds of discussion with a really big emphasis on finding commonalities and making sure that all voices are heard. So typically, you might give everyone a chance to speak, saying you can only speak once until every other voice has been heard, and then you can chime in again, so that no one voice can dominate the conversation. They build in slowness into the process. I read that they encourage, like if there's a microphone going around to the people, they encourage the mic person to kind of be slow. So that everyone has time to hear and absorb what's being said. There might be something called a vibe monitor, whose job is to sort of be aware of the body language in the community, so that if it seems to be getting overheated, they can signal that things need to be dialed back down. And then if consensus is not achieved in a vote, you go through it again. And you keep going through it. Maybe you break into smaller groups to iron out individual differences, but you really have to have a commitment to this process because you've got to keep going through it. And the positive side of consensus building is that it aims to always preserve community. And it tries to create decisions where there are no winners and losers. And the negative side is the difficulty in, oh my God, getting anything done, right? And the obvious power of inertia and the status quo in a setup where someone can effectively veto any change. So that's its challenge. But I think that Unitarian Universalist churches would probably benefit from a careful study of how consensus works, and we have a lot of examples to look at. Now, in the wider world of American politics, right? We don't have unlimited majority rule democracy. Part of the genius of the founders, however imperfectly realized, was the idea that we would enshrine a fundamental set of human rights, and those would be off the table. Those are not up for vote. Those are not up for discussion. Right? That was a brilliant innovation to the simple practice of democracy, which could lead to the tyranny of the majority. But it works much better at the federal level than at the state level, where there has been, in many states, we've seen, a very successful effort to effectively eliminate abortion rights, to weaken voting rights for minorities, to reintroduce religion into public schools through the back door of intelligent design, and to block equal rights for LGBT people on a variety of fronts, including marriage rights, and especially in Indiana, where we're fighting that fight right now. So that brings us to the title of today's sermon, Stepping Up. As we've been talking about our principles this year, we've also been talking about different virtues that might help them be better realized. And I think the relevant virtue for a fifth principle is the virtue of stepping up, of taking responsibility, of becoming engaged participants in the democratic process and in the civic process, rather than passive participants. And for UUs, I think that means being engaged in three different ways. First, they're simply making sure that our democratic voice is heard. Right? It does no good for us to have a unique voice, a voice for liberal religion, a voice that stands on the side of love, equality, and freedom if no one knows about it, if we don't make ourselves heard. And that can be as simple as voting, emailing a congressperson, contributing time or money to cause. Here in Indiana, many UUs have been working with Freedom Indiana, which is our Share the Plate designate of the month, to try to block HJR 3, which we already mentioned, but that's the bill that would write marriage inequality permanently into our Constitution. And many of our youth here at UUI, I don't know if everyone knows this, but many of the teenagers here, along with many adults, have really devoted hours and hours of their time on school nights, on weekends, working phone banks. And the point of the working the phone banks is to find people that are opposed to this bill and connect them to the legislator. It's just to make sure that the voices that stand on the side of love get heard. That's the whole point of that activity. Make sure that the voices get heard. And that's what they've been doing. And their dedication to that has been very impressive. And it's a tough fight. It's been a tough fight against this amendment. But there has been progress. In 2011, when the bill first came up for a vote, it passed 70 to 26 in the Indiana House. Not really any question there. This year, it barely made it out of committee and would not have except for a rather unkind trick played by the Speaker at the last moment. And when it went to a vote, it passed 57 to 40. It was a much narrower vote. And it only passed because the most discriminatory language was dropped from the bill, which is something that was a result of the hard work done by groups like Freedom Indiana. And the particular significance of that is because they altered the bill, they have to start this process over. So it pushes it back out into the future. It will not go on the ballot this November, at least it's not supposed to. And that gives its opponents more time to organize, to rally the troops, and to make the voices that stand on the side of love get heard. So it's a very significant victory. And it tells us that when we step up and when we are heard, we can win victories. The second way of being engaged as citizens is the path of civil disobedience. And we're going to talk about that more on February 16th, which is National Preach-In on Climate Change Day. Table that one for now. And the final way of being engaged is by making a long-term active commitment to the support and spread of liberal religious values. And this can be tricky because as UUs, we don't like to push our beliefs on other people, right? That's part of that whole respecting the right of conscience thing. We don't like to push our beliefs on people. But there's a difference between pushing our beliefs or obnoxiously evangelizing, and again, simply making sure that our voice and our values are always part of the conversation. And that our institution, this church as an institution, or other UU churches, are always visible in the civic landscape. The short-term goal maybe to win this or that political battle. And those victories are important. But the long-term goal is to change the culture, to create a society that is more loving, more humane, more inclusive and generous and peaceful. And for that, you need institutions that uphold those values steadily, faithfully, year after year after year. Democracy creates winners and losers. The ultimate goal of religion is to change people's hearts, which is to say, to build a new, more loving consensus, a consensus about what kind of society we want to be. In 2011, only 47% of Hoosiers opposed HJR3. In 2013, the number was up to 54%. So hearts are being changed. People are being reached. And that is what we really want, and that kind of change comes from getting our values out there. So when we fight for justice, we must remember to always do so with love, which is ultimately our greatest value and our greatest weapon. Because what we seek in the end is not just this victory or that victory, but ultimately the transformation of our society and our culture to greater depths of love and justice. Would you please rise in body or spirit for our closing hymn, number 121 in your great hymnal, Your Will Land.